If we're waiting around for our four-year colleges and universities to solve the problem of stalled economic mobility for kids from low-wealth families, it's going to be a very, very, very long wait.
Welcome to EdFix, your source for insights about the promise and practice of education. I'm your host, Michael Feuer. I am the Dean of the Graduate School of Education and Human Development at the George Washington University. I have a great honor today to welcome my guest for this episode of EdFix, whose name is Bob Schwartz. Bob Schwartz joined the Harvard University faculty in 1996, where he then spent 25 years, including 5 as the academic dean of the Graduate School of Education. In his spare time while he was at Harvard, Bob also became the president of an organization called Achieve, which, for any of our listeners who remember the heyday of American education, school reform, and the standards movement, know how important Achieve was and Bob's central role in promoting the ideals of the standards movement. In addition, Bob has been a consultant to business and government in many ways, and has been a philanthropist working at the Pew Charitable Trusts, where he has also been instrumental in promoting some of the most interesting initiatives in education. So, Bob, let's get to it. Welcome to EdFix. I'm eager to hear a little bit about your most recent work, and I know that you are continuing work on issues related to skills, the economy, and now most particularly the role of community colleges as a source, or as you call it in your latest book, an engine of American prosperity. First of all, welcome. It's wonderful to have you and have a chance to talk together. Tell us a little bit about this latest bit of work that you've been doing for all of our listeners.
Sure, and thanks, Michael. It's really a pleasure to be here. This new book on community colleges, which is a series of case studies of 5 community colleges that I and my co-author, Rachel Lipson, think do a particularly strong job in both putting kind of economic advancement front and center in terms of, for everybody who walks in the door, whether or not it's an 18-year-old straight out of high school or a 45-year-old looking for a short-term credential to kind of reskill himself or herself to move up in the labor market. And these schools that we've looked at behave as if they really have 2 clients, students first, obviously, but they also really take care to develop strong, deep relationships with industry leaders in their regions. So they're not simply kind of responding to the current economic circumstances in their region, but with economic development organizations and other kind of economic partners, they're really trying to reshape their region's economy as well. So it's interesting because, as you probably know, Michael, or you might infer, I came to community colleges relatively late in the game. I'm a high school person. I started my career as a high school teacher. I was a high school principal. I've always been interested in these issues, these transition issues, high school to college, high school to work. In the 90s, was very involved in the school to work movement then. And a decade ago, 11 years, actually 12 years ago, wrote a report with 2 Harvard colleagues called Pathways to Prosperity, in which we kind of challenged the notion that everybody was going to go off and get a 4-year degree and live happily ever after, and pointed out at that time the data suggested that this might be a nice wish, but we were extremely far from that at the time. About 28% of 25-year-olds had a 4-year degree. We've been making progress ever since, but we're still in a situation where barely half of 25-year-olds have a 4-year degree or better, or a 2-year degree, or even a short-term credential with value in the labor market. So we've got a big lift ahead of us, and particularly starting with this Pathways work that my wife and I and others started. It's a collaboration between it was nominally a partnership between the Graduate School of Education, which was me, and an organization called Jobs for the Future, which at the time had maybe 120 people now has over 350 people a decade or 12 years later. But we started this national network based on the really extraordinary response we got to the Pathways report that I just reflected on. And what we essentially were trying to do was to work with states and regions around the country to build strategies that spanned typically the last 2 years of high school and the first 2 years of post-secondary. And like a lot of people in this this part of the school reform world, if you want to call it that, we were building off of a lot of work over the last 20 years in career academies and similar kinds of projects. But most of that work kind of got stuck in high schools. It really became mostly a strategy for engaging kids, motivating them, persuading them to stick it out in high school by really trying to use careers and access to careers as a motivator. Our interest when we started the Pathways Network was really to think beyond high school and really think about building pathways into good careers, but particularly careers that did not necessarily require a 4-year degree. And like everybody else in that business, we kind of started with high schools and figured we would eventually get to community colleges and then to employers. And what we learned about halfway through the decade was the way to really do this work is start with employers, start with the demand side. Where are there employers? In what fields where employers really feeling the pain and significantly concerned enough about their talent pipelines to want to reach back and engage with education institutions. And it became clear to me, at least, that the education institution that employers were likeliest to want to work with, in the US at least, was the community college. Our employers tend to have a pretty short-term view of the world. Most of them, if you talk to them about 16-year-olds in their workplaces, they will roll their eyes. They'll think about their own 16-year-olds who they're trying to persuade to get out of bed in the morning and say, is this person going to actually add value to my workplace? And one of the, it's funny, I'm jumping around a bit, but if I go back to the Pathways report of 2011, one of the themes of that report was, one of the questions we really raised was, why is it that American policymakers have paid so little attention to what other countries around the world, especially European countries, like the Scandinavian countries, but especially Germany and Austria and Switzerland? Why have we learned so little from what these countries do to get a much, much larger fraction of their young people, not only through high school, but out the other end with credentials that have value in the labor market and that enable them to really get started by their early 20s in a career field? And we were particularly taken with the kind of the youth apprenticeship, so-called dual system countries, where young people are spending half their time, at a workplace and half their time in aligned education.
Before we go overseas and untangle the school to work issues and the labor markets of, let's say, Western Europe, I want to start with a more elementary question in case people wonder, what do we actually mean by community college?
Yeah.
My hunch is there's a lot of diversity and there's a whole ecology even within that sector.
Totally right. There's, 1,000 plus community and technical colleges. These are 2-year institutions, typically with few, if any, entrance requirements. They are the institutions where half of the Hispanic students in the country who go on to college start. About 40% of African American students start their college careers in community colleges. They are, given their size, they are, I like to say, within commuting distance of, all but the most rural Americans. But they vary widely in a whole bunch of dimensions. They are, I would argue, they both serve the neediest students in higher education, and they are the least well-funded institutions in higher education. They are typically multi-purpose institutions. They serve, young people right out of high school. They serve adults coming back for short-term training. They serve adults who are just, looking for some avocational program, something to do with their time. There are big regional variations. In places like Massachusetts, where I live, or New York, or California, most obviously, these institutions were mainly established to provide a low-cost first 2 years of a college education. So the transfer function tends to be the sort of the function that really dominates their work, and that's the function for which they get typically the most funding. In the South, by contrast, and in some Midwestern states, community colleges were really established primarily for workforce purposes. Smart governors in the late 50s and 60s in the South, wanting to attract northern companies to move south, had lots of things that they could offer. They could offer land, they could offer low taxes, they could offer no labor unions, right to work laws. But often, company leaders would say, well, that's all great, but when we look at your education system, we're really nervous. How are we going to get the skilled workers that we need if we're going to move, our plant to your state? And the answer, of governors like, Fritz Hollings in South Carolina and Bill Winters in Mississippi and, others I could rattle off, said, we'll build you a new set of institutions, workforce institutions, to get you a skilled workforce. So in the South, there's really very little debate about the purpose of community colleges, whereas there's a continuing debate elsewhere. We wrote this book, commissioned these case studies by 5 fabulous graduate students of ours, to really show what it takes to actually prioritize workforce development across a whole institution. And we picked places in different regions with different demographics, different industries. Nova would be the one I suspect known to the most of your listeners, among other things, because that's where the First Lady teaches. But it's in the DC area. It's a big institution. I don't know, 80,000 students, something like that. And we picked it in part because its reputation is really primarily, I would say, for the quality of its transfer programs. In particular, it has a program with George Mason that was the subject of a recent NewsHour kind of profile. But Ann Kress, the president, happened to come to Nova after several years leading Monroe Community College in Rochester. And that community college, she and her vice president, Todd Oldham, put that place on the map because this is a place with a declining manufacturing base where big companies, like Eastman Kodak, had died or left. And the community college is right in the middle of a significant effort to kind of restructure, reframe, the whole economy of the region. Challenge at Nova is very different, but what Ann and her colleagues have been able to do, in particular, has been to attract companies like Amazon and others in the high tech space with a lot of the programming that they do. So without at all diminishing the strength of their transfer programs, they've also built a really strong set of workforce programs.
I want to pick up on one of the points you made there, which is about these enlightened governors who invested in community colleges because they understood that would have economic benefit to their state.
Correct.
In other words, that there is a real public good aspect of community colleges.
Absolutely right.
So they serve employers who are trying to make a profit. It takes a public sector to organize the institution that then produces this value both to the public, to the employers, and by the way, to the individual students who derive a certain amount of return on this investment also.
In a sense, what we're trying to do with our book, we call it, the title is America's Hidden Economic Engines. And we say hidden because in much of the country, that's simply not the way legislators, governors, or others think about their community colleges, and they don't fund them. In Massachusetts, for example, our community colleges get no funding for workforce issues. There's a separate division, the kind of continuing education and workforce, typically over there someplace, and it's expected to raise its own money. And the way they raise their own money is, doing short-term contract work with companies. But this is not a strategy in most of these places for developing longer-term kind of talent pipeline kinds of approaches. And one of the, if I can digress for 1 minute, we picked 5 colleges to look at, and one is Pima in Tucson. When Lee Lambert, who's the current president, got there a decade ago, same thing as in Massachusetts. His workforce division was expected entirely to raise its own funding. He said, hey, wait a minute, this is one of the two most important functions in the institution. And if it's important to us, we have to fund it. A decade later, there are now 100 people in the workforce division, 30 of whom are entirely workforce facing and entirely employer facing. And as it happened, it's fine. By the way, these cases were all developed by graduate students with full course loads during COVID. So it was all these cases were done virtually, and we obviously were required very close cooperation from the college presidents to open doors, set up interviews, et cetera. But in May a year ago, Rachel Lipson, my co-editor, and we had a little bit of money, and she went out to Lorain Community College in Ohio, and I went out to Tucson to interview both leadership people in the college, but more importantly, employers and other leadership people in the community. The thing that really sticks with me from that, we did this 9-minute videos, but the thing that really sticks with me was that the vice president of the region's economic development agency called SunCard, or it's one of these quasi-governmental organizations, but 60 CEOs on its board, entirely focused on regional economic development. He said, we don't have a meeting that really matters without having somebody from Pima in the room. And then off the record, he said, we have the University of Arizona here, great university, we do a lot of work with them. But when it comes to nimbleness and flexibility and responsiveness to the needs of employers, it's Pima they're the ones that employers, they can answer employers' questions around skills and workforce. And so that was, to me, that's one of the things we were kind of looking for in these cases.
Let me pivot to one of the debate points that makes has a considerable amount of space even on the front pages, and that is the argument about whether community college should become essentially free to students.
Yeah.
What's the plus minus on that?
Yeah, it's funny. I was a participant in a kind of group, mostly college presidents, who were drafting a statement of basically focused on short-term Pell. There's this debate around whether or not Pell Grants ought to be opened up so that rather than requiring people to be, at least, full-time 6 months or whatever, where they should be opened up for shorter-term programs. And I refused to kind of sign off on this statement that was actually being sent to congressional leaders, in part because the issue of free community college came up. And I'm a kind of outlier on this, I think, which is that my view is that the only rationale for free community college, in my mind, ought to be if we really do see community colleges as primarily engines for economic workforce and economic development. My nightmare is extending 2 more years of compulsory education to extend high school, in effect, into community college. As you know, senior year in many places is a kind of lost year. And then one reason that I and my colleagues have pushed so hard around moving the acceleration and expansion of the early college high school movement and dual enrollment is a lot of kids are really ready to move on and move directly into early college programming. In fact, one of the things that's keeping community colleges afloat these days is typically something like 20% of their enrollment is coming from high school kids. And to me, that's a significant plus if we act on it in the right way. I want to say kind of 2 more things that are related while I'm thinking of it. One is that a pushback argument that anybody who knows the data can make to me is, hey, wait a minute, 80% of people who walk in the door of a community college say they're there to get a 4-year degree. I'm talking about first-time, full-time students coming out of high school. 6 years later, only about 15% actually succeed. So, why do you think community colleges are such great institutions to really kind of hang your hat on?
What percentage actually succeed?
15%.
15.
15. This is actually 2 people that you've interviewed before, Sandy Baum and actually it was Sandy and Harry Holzer who did a book on community colleges where that particular data point came out. The other interesting data point, and this is putting some things together here, is that to me it's really striking that even now, mostly post-COVID, when everybody's screaming about labor shortages, 40% of 25-year-olds with 4-year degrees are working in jobs that didn't really require a 4-year degree. So you've got the question is how do we put these data pieces together? And to me, they both enforce at least the argument that we like to make, which is that we really need to focus much more attention on getting the mass of young people through to a first post-secondary credential with value in the labor market. First post-secondary credential with value in the labor market. Our premise is that, at least in metropolitan America, unless you have some credential beyond a high school diploma, the likelihood of your being able to kind of get on a path that can lead you to a middle class, middle income wage, family supporting wage, however you want to put it, is very low. You are likely to be stuck in low skill, low wage work. But it doesn't obviously, a lot of economists will say, well, yes, that's right. And guess what? You need a 4-year degree. We've been arguing all along, and we think there's a lot of data that suggests it's no longer simply a matter of how much education you get, but to what degree the skills that you get actually match the requirements of your regional labor market. So, we focus on industry certifications. We focus on short-term and 1-year post-secondary certificates. We focused on 2-year applied degrees, as well as 4-year degrees. We think an apprenticeship. We think those options all ought to be on the table. But the operating question always ought to be, we should be looking at these options, if you will, always with one eye on the labor market. That may seem overly instrumental, and I'm happy to have a debate about, what's the purpose of higher ed? Is it only, to get people started on a job? Obviously, I don't believe that. But we see evidence all around us that of its growing disaffection with 4-year degrees, parents expressing increasing skepticism, students expressing increasing skepticism, and employers increasingly, largely in the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement, now saying, let's figure out some ways to move more towards skill-based hiring. Let's depend less on degrees and more on skills. And we're seeing big companies, IBM, 5 years ago, 90% of their job postings required a 4-year degree. Now it's down to 50%. They're building their own, they're hiring people and then training them, which is great. And we're seeing, Accenture and other big companies doing something similar. So this is not to say, I and almost everybody else I work with are the products of liberal arts education. And, we obviously continue to value that. But we've got to figure out some way to respond to the concerns around both cost and time. I carry around one slide with me, in a world of, that's data focused. This is a slide that is based on the work of a sociologist at the University of Michigan named Fabian Pfeffer. What he did was look at everyone born in the 1970s and the 1980s, and he put them into 3 groups by family wealth: top 20%, middle 40%, bottom 40%, and asked 2 questions. What proportion of each group by age 25 had a 4-year degree? And what proportion had some post-secondary education? And as you might guess, the top 20%, who we're not going to worry much about as a matter of public policy, it's about 60% have a 4-year degree. And you could ask, gee, why is it so low relative to, but that's about twice the national average. Actually, in the middle 40%, it's about 33%. It's been going up. I think I've now seen it maybe 37%, 4-year degree or higher. But in the bottom 40%, just think about that, bottom 40%. For those born in the 1970s, it was 11.3%. For those born in the 1980s, 11.8%. So essentially, absolutely flat line. And we could spend our hour unpacking that. But to me, the bottom line policy implication is, if we're waiting around for our 4-year colleges and universities to solve the problem of stalled economic mobility for kids from low wealth families, it's going to be a very, very, very long wait. So trying to figure out, and community colleges, for better or worse, that's where the public investment is, right? You hear a lot of talk about these wonderful, Year Up, wonderful program, Perscolas, wonderful program, boot camps, et cetera. You hear a lot of talk about the programs funded under the federal WIOA legislation, the Workforce Investment Opportunity Act. It's like, they add up to 2% of the population. It's, the public institution with the infrastructure and where public resources are not enough, but the place we ought to be focusing on, I would argue, to both get many more young people through to that first post-secondary credential and to be able to address the increasing problems of adults, whose jobs are disappearing and getting them skills to get back into the labor market and move forward. It's the community colleges. That's what we've got. So figuring out how to make them work to address these big social policy problems, to me, that's what our book is aimed at.
Yeah, so maybe part of the problem is that with all of the warts and pimples on the American school system, we still do have the most productive labor force in the world. So some people who listen to this must be thinking, well, gosh, why would we want to make some kind of huge national investment in skills and that sort of thing when actually people seem to be, the economy is humming even with its very hidden economic engines.
We have something like 44% of the workforce working for $17 an hour or less. We have 35% of Americans, I saw just in a wonderful housing article yesterday in the Times Magazine section or on Sunday, who have, significant housing problems of one kind or another. I mean, we continue to be a hugely inequitable society. Given the changing demographics, we may have a highly productive workforce now, but if we don't address these problems, of our education system and our workforce system, 15 years from now, we're not going to have that.
Thank you so much, Bob Schwartz. The title of Bob and Rachel Lipson's new book is America's Hidden Economic Engines: How Community Colleges Can Drive Shared Prosperity. And I just want to thank you for what you've done so far for American education and, for that matter, global education. And to wish you well and say thank you on behalf of EdFix. For our listeners, if you enjoyed this episode, which I know you did, you can subscribe to the EdFix podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Google Podcasts, or wherever you may be listening to your podcasts. Our executive producer, engineer, technical maven, and all-purpose superb communications officer, Turan Waters, makes all of this possible. We have a website called edfixpodcast.com. And once again, thank you to Bob Schwartz.